Okay, it's a bittersweet night, this being the last talk, and I was going to do this last talk on both Dorothy Sayers and Charles Williams, and I did so much research on Charles Williams that I realized it was just going to be impossible to try to do both thinkers in one night. So you're going to have to wait, maybe have a coffee conversation with me about Dorothy Sayers. But tonight is Charles Williams, and he is truly one of the most important members of the Inklings. So it would be wrong to leave him out. I did find a lot of interesting things about him as I did research, and I had heard that he was weird from people, but I didn't realize how weird he is. And you know, there's some things I read that I almost was just thinking, why in the world was C.S. Lewis friends with this man? I mean, they were sort of that shocking. But then I've read a few of his novels, and they are worth the time and attention, and they do something really magical, especially with regard to the Christian imagination. And so I hope that, you know, I always start with a little bio of the thinker. I hope that after you hear that, you aren't so turned off by it that you don't take his ideas seriously. I want you to take them seriously, and I think no matter what someone is involved in, they still have the ability to impart truth to us. So here we go. Charles Williams, full name, Charles Walter Stansby Williams, was born in London in 1886. He was the only son of a journalist who contributed verse and stories and articles to popular magazines. So he did come from a father who is a writer. He was educated at a school called St. Albans School in Hertfordshire, and he was awarded a scholarship to the University College London, but he was forced to leave early without taking his degree because his family lacked financial support, financial resources. And his family was generally fairly poor in his growing up years. He was then luckily hired by Oxford University Press and climbed quickly and became the editor. And if you're familiar with the publishing world and the academic publishing world, Oxford University Press is one of the top publishers that are out there. So him becoming editor, and I think he stayed editor until his death, is quite an accomplishment. He also, I was surprised and happy to find out that one of his greatest achievements was he made it possible for the publication of the first English version of Soren Kierkegaard's works. So before he came around, Kierkegaard was unknown to the English-speaking world, and that was made possible by him. So I'm grateful to him for that. So he's chiefly remembered as a novelist, but he also published poetry, works of literary criticism, theology, drama, history, biography, and a lot of book reviews. He actually is most proud of his poetry, particularly his Arthurian poetry, but readers tend to find it more obscure than his novels, which they tend to prefer. And his novels are where I would start if you were going to start reading Charles Williams. Some of his best known novels are called War in Heaven, Descent into Hell, which is the book we're going to talk about tonight, and All Hallows Eve. And in 1917, Williams married his the first woman he fell in love with, Florence Conway, and they had a long courtship, and then he wrote poetry for her, and that actually ended up being being the collection of his first published poetry. I get the feeling that he was a very romantic man. I think he wrote like 700 poems for his wife during their entire marriage. And so she had and even his letters to her, I think, were published because they were just so deep and insightful and probably romantic. So they had one son, Michael, who was born in 1924. He was a very winsome person. I'm going to talk about this in a second. And he tended it tended to be the case that young women fell in love with him often. So they would be his sort of female disciples and just become enamored with him. And it wasn't just women that were. I mean, men were enamored with him too, in the sense of he had a presence that he brought. But this is one of the sort of questionable parts of his life that we don't sort of know. I don't know. I didn't do enough research to know if there was anything that occurred like outside of marriage or whatever. But I do know that there were many women who sought after him. And this is also where it gets weird. He was a member of A.E. Waite's occult secret society called the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross for 10 formative years. He rose high in their ranks, led initiates into practicing alchemy, astrology, Kabbalism, conjuration, divination with tarot cards, and meditation on the Sephirotic tree. From what I can tell, this was actually kind of trendy in early 20th century Britain. It was something that all of the intelligentsia was sort of dabbling in, and I know C.S. Lewis himself had some temptations towards the occult, which sounds crazy to us because I don't think it's as prevalent now, but it was among sort of Oxford society at the time. I'm not quite sure Williams kept that as a part of his life to the very end. So his initiation into the Inklings was in the last 6 years of his life. So he claims to have been an Anglican, a dedicated Anglican all his life, and wrote several works of theology, but he was only a member of the Inklings at the very end. So it does make me wonder if he left some of these practices behind as he became more a member of the Inklings. I do know that Tolkien had some reservations about Williams, and that actually caused some tension between him and Lewis. There were times when Tolkien wanted him sort of kicked out of the group. So, but Lewis was a big fan. T.S. Eliot has described Williams' novels as supernatural thrillers because he says they explore the sacramental intersection of the physical with the spiritual, while also examining the ways in which power, even spiritual power, can corrupt as well as sanctify. So something that is true of Williams' novels is that he seems to always be inhabiting, and I find this fascinating, but always be consciously inhabiting both time and eternity. That there's just always this sense that he is in sort of in time, in space, but that he's simultaneously an eternal being created for God. And so he doesn't, a lot of people said that in his presence, the supernatural seemed to become more real for them. And it was because his experience of reality was always with the natural and the supernatural sort of integrated and laying side by side, and that you actually see that in his novels. A lot of the novels, there's just and that's why they're sort of weird, because we kind of tend to see reality in more natural ways and less supernatural. And so he kind of pushes the envelope on that, and thinks that there's quite a bit going on supernaturally all the time, and kind of describes reality in that way. So W.H. Auden, one thing that's different about his fantasies is they are all set in the contemporary world. So that's one thing that makes him different from Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien and Lewis had these other worlds that they created that their characters sort of journeyed in, and all of Charles Williams' novels are set in Britain in his own time period, which is interesting for fantasy, because you would think of fantasy as being in a sort of otherworldly place. Auden, W.H. Auden, one of Williams's greatest admirers, reportedly reread Williams's extraordinary and highly unconventional history of the church called The Descent of the Dove every single year. And Auden's like very well-respected Christian poet. So it's really interesting to me that he sort of made this commitment to reread this history of the church by Williams every single year. I'm convinced that I need to read it after some of the research I've done. Williams also was extremely interested in Dante and in Dante's story of Beatrice, the romantic love between himself and Beatrice, and the sort of way that a romantic relationship has a mirror of Christ's love for the church. And some of his work in Dante and in King Arthur myths is sort of still regarded by scholars as extremely important. And Dorothy Sayers was so inspired by Williams's work on Dante that that's what led her to translate the Divine Comedy, which is now sort of a respected edition. Greatest admirer of Williams is probably C.S. Lewis. It's thought that his novel, That Hideous Strength, is inspired by Williams. And at Williams's death, Lewis said this. He said, "The world seemed to us at that moment primarily a strange one. That sense of strangeness continued with a force which sorrow itself has never quite swallowed up. This experience of loss, the greatest I have yet known, was wholly unlike what I should have expected. It is one of the many paradoxes in Williams that while no man's conversation was less gloomy in tone, it was indeed a continual flow of gaiety, enthusiasm, and high spirits. No man at times said darker things. He never forgot the infinite menaces of life, the unremitted possibility of torture, maiming, madness, bereavement, and overall that economic insecurity which, as he said in War in Heaven, poisons our sorrows as well as modifying our joys." He also wrote, "You have heard of the death of my dearest friend Charles Williams and no doubt prayed for him. For me too it has been and is a great loss, but not at all a dejecting one. It has greatly increased my faith. Death has done nothing to my idea of him, but he has done, oh, I can't say what, to my idea of death. It has made the next world much more real and palpable. We all feel the same, how one lives and learns." There are multiple things written by Lewis in letters to friends about the way that Williams's death in particular affected him and impacted his own faith and his hope for heaven and belief in its reality. So, and it was something that his death was sort of, it was a surprise. They didn't know how badly he was doing in the infirmary, and I think Lewis was going to send a message to him the next day and then just found him dead. And so I think that was one of the things that was hard for their relationship, is that he just didn't see it coming. But you can see in the letters that he wrote that as he reflected on the man, he said that his goodness became even more powerful and present and strong, thinking back on his memory after his death than it had even been while he was alive. So personality. This is also where it gets slightly interesting. He was himself like his writing, charismatic. So charismatic is probably the word that I saw most attributed to Williams. And then he was also, like, by almost everyone that met him, regarded as saintly, almost like the most saintly person they'd ever met. Loquacious, inspiring, but complex and confusing. When he walked into a room, people felt the place light up with charity and sanctity. Whenever he conversed with someone, that person felt more intelligent, godly, virtuous, and beautiful. He was known for a frantic, high-energy work life and a tendency to break into creative flight of speech. According to Lewis, everyone who met him fell in love with him, including many young women who became his disciples, and they like tended, Lewis says, to heighten his creativity. So yeah, not sure what I think about that. So he has this animating personality, and it's something, and maybe all of us know someone like this. When you talk to them, something in yourself comes alive, and you believe more fully in goodness than you ever have before, and it seems impossible that God could be losing. in reality. And I think that he had that effect on people, and like inspired a lot of people's faith, even high level intellectuals like T.S. Eliot and Auden and C.S. Lewis. He also, though, sort of would think on and even sort of what's the word, ruminate on very dark things in reality. And I think that part of it for him was that it seems like he was just a very empathetic person, and so when he met someone, he could read the pain in their face that they were carrying, and was infinitely interested in allowing them like time to talk about it, seeing if he could do anything to help it. A lot of people said that after they would hang out with him, they thought they had just been through an incredible therapy session or something. And so he carried a darkness that was sort of this weight of the world, of the people that he encountered, and he did struggle with doubt. So he said, "At bottom, a darkness has always haunted me. As you know, I am a Christian as far as I am by compulsion of mind and sense." Once when he was asked to speak at a conference about the Christian faith, he wrote to his wife, "Am I a Christian? I don't know, but I know what Christianity possibly may be." So skepticism, his own skepticism, can be traced somewhat to his childhood. He used to take long walks with his father, and his father and he would engage in these extremely long debates over ideas and beliefs, worldviews, and that sounded actually really similar to some of the conversations I had with my dad growing up that I cherished. But he also would say that his father always had this habit of really pushing him to see every single side of the argument, never being satisfied to have just fully shown that one side wins, but to stop and look at these other points of view. And that system, or that tendency, seems to have stayed with him as a person, but it also might have contributed to making it difficult for him to exclusively choose the Christian faith, and not let other belief systems in a kind of way that sort of blended them with one another, which might explain some of his interest in magic and the occult and things like that. So the skepticism, tendency to doubt, sometimes would grow into a deep internal darkness. So this man, who everyone that encountered him would say this is the most saintly person that I've met, he would say of his own self that he says, "I am in a period where I find everyone's face repulsive and their voices unendurable, and it is extraordinary how I dislike people." He had a kind of chronic depression and suffered from a sense of gloom. He would write his wife often about carrying this sort of gloom around with him. And Lewis, who saw this side of him, I think, more than anyone else, said that there's a double-sidedness which is the most strongly developed character of his mind. So that in one sense he was a skeptic and even a pessimist, but on this other side of him, he sort of had the willpower to believe when everyone else was ready to give up. So sort of carried both in this sort of full sense. I already said the word saint was often attributed to him. A lot of people would even call him an angel. They almost felt like they were talking to an angel, and that he was radiant and riveting. According to Lewis, both in public and private, he is nearly all the men I've met, the one whose address most overflows with love. Upon his death, Lewis called him my great friend Charles Williams, my friend of friends, the comforter of our little set, and the most angelic of the Inklings. W.H. Auden wrote of his first meeting with Williams, and he says, "For the first time in my life, I felt myself in the presence of personal sanctity. I felt transformed into a person who is incapable of doing or thinking anything base or unloving. T.S. Eliot claimed that the man himself had an immediate charm and likability, a radiation of benevolence and amiability, that he was somehow protected from evil and was himself a protection, and that I have never known a healthier minded man than Williams. And he also just, and I mentioned this before, but lived as if the supernatural was always nearby. So this is a quote from a biographer. He says, or actually someone who knew him, "I've never met any human being in whom the divisions between body and spirit, natural and supernatural, temporal and eternal, were so non-existent, nor any writer who so consciously took their non-existence for granted. He lifted his friends and associates up into a world of angelic order and chivalry, where everyone treated everyone else with the gracious etiquette of heaven." So it's really hard, and it's almost kind of sad to study a person who it seems that even more than their writings, it was their personal presence that actually had this immense impact on people. And all we can go with now are these descriptions that people would give of their encounters and his books themselves. But I do think that there is something beautiful about the way that these sort of major thinkers describe him having this impact of, like, by talking to him, I had no doubt that love exists in this world, and that I am also capable of loving in a self-sacrificial way. That he was able to sort of bring that out of people, and I think that connects with the conversation we've been having over the last 6 weeks about the imagination. I have this sense that he enlarged their imaginations and in their ability to see light as being greater and grander than darkness is, while also, it seems, really being able to affirm the darkness. It doesn't seem like he shied away from it at all. It wasn't sort of he wasn't sort of happy-go-lucky necessarily. He seemed like he carried the sadness of people more than or as much as they were carrying it themselves, and then somehow lifted them out of it. So that's his personality. That's something I think I read this about him before I read his first novel, and it helped me go into it sort of seeing the person behind the writing, and I think helped me appreciate some of the things he was doing more. His writing style, I personally had trouble reading this and understanding it, and I read a lot of books and hard books, and I will say there were passages in here that I read through, and I was thinking, I have no idea what I just read at all, and like maybe would read it 5 times and still like not know what I had just read. What I did, well, I will say is that, so the quotes that we're going to look at tonight are all from this book, so you will get a chance to see his writing come out. The section that we're going to look at is quite clear, I think. I think it's some of the writing that invites anyone into, and we'll be able to talk about it and think about it. But there are these points where these characters have visions, have experiences, have dreams, and he just takes you into this place that you've never been before, and it's one in which the supernatural, as I've already described, the supernatural and the natural are both present, and in certain ways it seems like all of the rules of what to expect in reality are kind of gone, and anything can happen that you're about to encounter, and things sort of start to make sense and start to meld together, but you sort of don't know where he's taking you or why he's taking you there. So I said this last week actually about Tolkien, that in Tolkien there are sections that some find laborious to get through, that they're just very detailed description of the external world, his world that he's creating. A lot of Tolkien fans don't find it laborious at all. They eat it up, but a lot of people do. And I said last week, I highly just recommend pushing through it. You push through it because you win something on the other side, and I think that's true with Williams. I think it's good to know, if I start reading this book, there will be times where my brain hurts, and I will have no idea what I just read. And I would say, don't wait till you understand it to move on to the next chapter. Just keep reading. Just keep going through the whole thing. I think it'll wash over you. And the parts that are strange, in certain ways, he means them to be strange, and he wants sort of to jar your imagination, to sort of open it up a little bit and make it sort of ready to receive more. So C.S. Lewis says of his writing style, he is writing that sort of book in which we begin by saying, let us suppose that this everyday world were at some one point invaded by the marvelous. And I think that's true. I think that as you're reading, I said, you know, you have this sense as you're reading that all bets are off as far as what to expect in the natural world, and I think that in every chapter something can come in to this very natural surrounding, British, you know, countryside in his own time period, that you didn't know that was possible, that kind of thing happened, and it does in his world. But as a Christian, you can't actually deny it either. That it all sort of seems consistent with believing in God and miracles and in the way that these things work. The Christian faith is an unstated background in his novels, which means that the characters very rarely talk about religion. I'd say I mean, it is true. They very rarely talk about religion. Sometimes it is very direct. So in the passage we're going to read tonight, there is a direct reference to Christ. So I think it does come in, but you could read it as a secular reader, and I think be taken in and changed, and not quite know what he's already moved you into. Sort of you've already been put into this sort of Christian sphere without realizing that you are. It is only in one book that they go to church, and even when they do talk about their faith, it would take quite the careful reading to figure out which faith they were discussing. That is true sometimes. He says, one of the characters in this book says this, and I think it might be true of Williams: he would rather have the meaning lost than too firmly explained, which is interesting. So he'd rather not, if you're going to have two sides, two options, either the meaning's lost, so the reader feels a little bit like they're grappling in the dark, or I took the meaning and I explained it way too clearly. He's going to say he'd rather have some of the meaning lost, and the reader feeling a little like they're in the dark. And so, which for some people is just maddening, because they're reading because they want clarity, you know, and he almost gives you less as you go through. But I think he delivers more in the end. Also, even though spiritual truths resonate through every word of these books, they are not Christian allegories, as Lewis does in the Narnia series. They function on two levels. Their underlying structure is derived from religion. Romantic love is actually something that comes into almost every single book. He has a very strong sense of romantic love having a lot to teach us in terms of what the true love of Christ for the church is, and he brings that in a lot. And then there's the superstructure of the workings of material and magical power. He doesn't quite explain where this sort of magical power comes from, but a lot of the sort of plots have to do with the tanglings of romantic love, the challenges of it, and then magic invading reality, and those two clashing with one another and trying to see what to do about it. The thing that's beautiful about these is that they can be loved by anyone, his books, by the Christian or the non-Christian. And I especially think that if you have a skeptical mind reading his books, that they actually can sort of invade that skeptical mind with truth in a way that a work like Narnia possibly couldn't, because it's so overt in what it's doing. It also, this is certainly true of Charles Williams, and maybe something Lewis liked about him, is that they take these basic same doctrines of the Christian faith that we've always had, and he just has this knack for explaining them in a new, like, fresh and timeless way. That it's almost like reading a certain parable for the first time. I think tonight when we read through this passage, you're going to think of Christ's words that we should carry one another's burdens, and it will be like encountering that verse for the first time because of the way that Charles Williams introduces the concept, and it will also make us think, like, what does that verse mean? So the major doctrine that I want us to look at tonight, it's not called this in Descent into Hell, but this is what it's called in his overall theology. It's called co-inherence. And it actually is a word that originally comes from the Church Fathers. And it was an idea based on the Trinity and the love within the Trinity. And the idea of co-inherence is that the Trinity has of God has this natural interdependent, self-sacrificing, self-giving love that sort of flows and is like mutual knowledge and love of one another. And for Williams, instead of taking a lot of examples of man's love and saying that will help us understand God's love, in certain ways what he wanted to do is take Trinitarian love and let that explain how we should love one another. Let that sort of be the guiding force through which we sort of understand what it means to. And there is a verse, I was going to look it up before this so I could tell you exactly where it is, but I think it's in John. It says that it says of people of the church, the body of Christ, that they will know each other as I know you. Jesus says this to the Father. They will know and love each other as I know and love you, which is, it's crazy to imagine. I mean, all of us in encountering people, you get to know people, you get to love them, but you hit walls. You hit this like wall that you can't see beyond it. There's something that they have that's private, that's kept beyond you, that maybe there's a protection there, but there's always something that keeps sort of one human being from knowing completely another human being, and that's sometimes feels safer, also sometimes feels painful, especially when you love another person. I would think, in marriage in certain ways there's a desire to know more intimately. And what Williams thinks is that the promise of co-inherence or Trinitarian love is that we're actually created to know each other in that full way. That the fall has broken that down. That in creation originally, there weren't walls of knowledge between Adam and Eve, and that the only reason it sounds scary to us to be known in that way is because we live in a fallen world, and that's the only reason that it feels threatening. But that if we are in a redeemed setting, that being known and knowing as deeply as the Father and the Son know each other and the Holy Spirit is actually, for us, the most freeing thing that we could possibly experience with another human being. So it's interesting because I read this section that we're about to read to a friend of mine, and it disturbed him, and it's a section about taking on another person's burden and really carrying it for them. And I think that Williams thinks that the idea of depending on other people, of letting yourself be known by them, of giving yourselves over to that kind of love or knowledge is one of the most frightening things that you can do in your life, that we like run away from intimacy. And one of the things that is strong in all of his novels is this idea that the good is terrifying to the fallen human being, but it's so good regardless. but that in a sense we have to realize how terrifying it is to us in our fallen state before we can see how truly good it is for us when we sort of give ourselves over to it, and that there's true joy found there. But it takes thinking in a very different way than we've thought, in a sort of self-protective way is what we tend to think. So with that, let's turn to the novel. Any questions so far? Okay. Yeah, so the occult stuff is really the stuff that is creepy with Williams, and the weird women disciples thing. So we're just going to lay that on the table. That was there. Who knows what was involved in that, and look at this novel. So just to set up the plot, the basic plot, because we're really going to just look at one passage. It takes place on this hill in a countryside outside of London. There are townspeople that are staging and putting on a play. There's a famous playwright. His name is Peter Stanhope, and he's written a play that all of the characters are working at performing together. And the play actually has a lot of spiritual themes going on that, as the actors work through the play, they actually start to be sort of spiritually changed by the characterization and the plot things that he's thrown into the play itself. The thing that you all need to know for our discussion is that one of the actors, by the name of Pauline Anstruther, she is a young, intelligent, but rather bitter young woman who keeps to herself to a certain extent, doesn't show her cards, and has been haunted since her childhood by seeing her doppelganger. Seeing basically a copy of herself. And this is so interesting and strange, but this second self, the second version of her, sometimes appears at a distance, walking toward her, and then it turns aside. And in the course of the novel, it's appeared more often in the past 2 years than ever before. So she lives in this perpetual dread. She's terrified of the day she'll meet her other self, and she thinks that when that happens, she will go mad and die. The apparition doesn't have a discernible cause. We don't know if she's crazy or if she just struggles with anxiety. There isn't any event or trauma from her childhood that we're told has caused it, but it seems like the thing is a trauma that's sort of plaguing her. And in this context of the conversation we're about to read, the first quote, which we'll look at, gives just the sense of, I think, a glimpse into what Charles Williams's probably personality and character would have been like, which is one that, upon meeting another human being, knows when they're carrying something, can tell they're carrying something, and sort of leads them to confess it, leads it to sort of come out of them as something that, like, I can't solve this on my own. I need help. So this first quote on your handout. But tell me why you always look so about you, and what you are looking for. Do I? She asks hesitatingly. He turned a serious gaze on her, and her own eyes turned away before it. He said, "There's nothing worth quite so much vigilance or anxiety. Watchfulness, but not anxiety, not fear. You let it into yourself when you fear it so, and whatever it is, it's less than your life." "You talk as if life were good," she said. "It's either good or evil," he answered, "and you can't decide that by counting incidents on your fingers. The decision is of another kind." So They're very, in the context of the story, they're very new acquaintances. He doesn't, in a sense, he hasn't established this friendship in which he can ask sort of these deeper things about her, but he sees it. And in certain ways, he's the first character to even notice that she's carrying something that she can't let go of. And it even describes his, he sees how she's sort of sitting stiffly in her chair. She keeps to herself. There's something guarded. And I think that he believes that the first step of self-sacrificial love is that your imagination is so wired that you go through the day noticing people in this state. That you notice people that are like tense, that have something that they're carrying on their face, that they're not letting out, and just look for subtle opportunities to draw that out of them, as a loving sort of caring like fellow human being. I have had I don't know if they're paid to do this, but I know I have had multiple times in Trader Joe's where the cashier has noticed that I'm having a hard day, and they'll say, you know, how's your day? It looks like things are really tough. And this is a complete stranger, and I just am like, it is so hard. Like, this happened and this happened, you know. And I just like go through it, and I'm almost in tears, and they're just looking and listening and just nodding their head, and I feel so loved. And again, I don't know if they're paid to do this or not. I don't even want that thought to enter my mind, because it does feel so genuine, and I think it is genuine. But we think that we can't do this. We think that everyone has their little world that they're living in, and we have certain people that we're allowed to encounter and ask how they're doing, and other people that we're not, and that we all live in these sort of safe compartments. And I think Charles Williams wants to challenge that idea. I think he thinks part of the Christian imagination is walking around and being ready to ask a stranger how their day is going, and even someone who you see the look of pain on their face. So moving on to the next quote. It's me, she repeated. So she's explaining her, he's gotten her to open up, he's gotten her to explain this doppelganger, this fear that she has of seeing her second self. It's me, she repeated. It comes from a long way off, and it comes up towards me, and I'm terrified. One day it'll come on and meet me. It hasn't so far. It's turned away or disappeared, but it won't always. It'll come right up to me, and then I shall go mad or die. Why? He asked quickly, and she answered at once. Because I'm afraid, dreadfully afraid. But, he said, that I don't quite understand. You have friends. Haven't you asked one of them to carry your fear? Carry my fear, she said, sitting rigid in her chair, so that her arms, which had lain so lightly, pressed now into the basket work, and her long, firm hands gripped it as if they strangled her own heart. How can anyone else carry my fear? Can anyone else see it and have to meet it? Still, in that public place, leaning back easily as if they talked of casual things, he said, "You're mixing up two things. Think a moment, and you'll see. The meeting it, that's one thing, and we can leave it till you're rid of the other. It's the fear we're talking about. Has no one ever relieved you of that? Haven't you ever asked them to? Will you tell me whether you've any notion of what I'm talking about? And if not, will you let me do it for you?" She attended reluctantly, as if to attend were an unhappy duty she owed him, as if she had owed to others and tried to fulfill them. She said politely, "Do it for me." "It can be done, you know," he went on. "It's surprisingly simple. And if there's no one else you care to ask, why not use me? I'm here at your disposal, and we could so easily settle it that way. Then you needn't fear it, at least, and then again for the meeting. That might be a very different business if you weren't distressed." "But how can I not be afraid?" she asked. "It's hellish nonsense to talk like that. I suppose that's rude, but It's no more nonsense than your own story, he said. That isn't very well. This isn't. We all know what fear and trouble are. Very well. When you leave here, you'll think of yourself that I've taken this particular trouble over instead of you. You do as much for me if I needed it, or for anyone, and I will give myself to it. I'll think of what comes to you, and imagine it, and know it, and be afraid of it. And then, you see, you won't. So this character, Peter Stanhope, he's encountered this woman, Pauline. He's read that there's a distress that she's carrying, a fear, and maybe one that we can't even relate to. I don't know how many of you have had fears of your doppelganger meeting you on the road, but we have fears. We all have fears. So whether it's flying an airplane, snakes, I'm very afraid of snakes, or even sort of an ambiguous dread or anxiety. We all have them. So he's noticed just by the look of her face that she's carrying this. He's drawn it out, and he has asked her if she has asked anyone to carry her fear for her, which sounds really strange, because you tend to think you have to deal with your own issues. Someone can't deal with your issues for you. Why would you think that they could? And wouldn't it be a silly thing to ask someone, will you carry my fear of flying when I go fly to Hawaii this weekend? How could that possibly work? Plus, if it's weighing on you, why would you want to worry about being a burden on someone else? Doesn't that seem like a crazy thing to ask another person, a stranger, but then a friend even, to ask a friend to carry something that you're suffering from that's weighing you down terribly. So all these thoughts are going through her head. I think she thinks he's probably a little crazy, and he's getting the sense that she hasn't asked anyone. She doesn't even know that it is possible, and he's already offering, well, why don't you just let me be the one that carries it? So, and this is where Williams's doctrine of substituted love comes in this next quote. Come, he said, listen. When you go from here, when you're alone, when you think you'll be afraid, let me put myself in your place and be afraid instead of you. He sat up and leaned towards her. It's so easy, he went on, easy for both of us. It needs only the act. For what can be simpler than for you to think to yourself that since I am there to be troubled instead of you, therefore you needn't be troubled? And what can be easier than for me to carry a little while a burden that isn't mine? She said, still perplexed at his strange language. But how can I cease to be troubled? Will it leave off coming because I pretend it wants you? Is it your resemblance that hurries up the street? It is not, he said, and you shall not pretend at all. The thing itself you may one day meet. Never mind that now. But you'll be free from all distress, because that you can pass on to me. Haven't you heard it said that we ought to bear one another's burdens? But that means, she began and stopped. I know, Stanhope said. It means listening sympathetically, thinking unselfishly, and being anxious about, and so on. Well, I don't say a word against all of that. No doubt it helps. But I think when Christ or St. Paul or whoever said bear, or whatever he Aramaically said instead of bear, he meant something much more like carrying a parcel instead of someone else. To bear a burden is precisely to carry it instead of. If you're still carrying yours, I'm not carrying it for you. However sympathetic I may be, if you give a weight to me, you can't be carrying it yourself. All I'm asking you to do is to notice that blazing truth. It doesn't sound very difficult. When I first read this, so I struggle with, I mentioned this last week, I struggle with depression. I also struggle with anxiety. And it's one of those things that I carry within me that I often can't explain to anyone else because it doesn't make rational sense. A lot of times it doesn't seem like it's linked with things going, badly in my life or anything. Sometimes it can just be the toast is burnt or something, and I'm just like crying. And actually, the lack of rationality in it is the very thing that makes it extremely hard to confide in another person about and explain it to them and have them sympathize. So when I say almost every evening, around 6 or 7, my like soul, if I'm alone, my soul sort of goes into this pit of despair, and I think I'll never climb out. When they hear that and think, that sounds rough, like, sorry to be you. I'll pray for you, and like that's all they can do, and there's love there and there's concern, but it also sounds really foreign and strange, and I know it does. As I say it out loud, I know it does, and so for me, so in Williams's conception, you need two acts, two individuals. You need the carrier of the burden, and you need the person to accept, the person who accepts and believes their burden can be carried. For a long time, I didn't even sort of acknowledge the fact out loud to other people that this sort of suffering was going on inside of me. And the more I was a mom and realized I couldn't hide it from my daughters who were around me all the time, they started to notice, they started to pray for me, and then the more I started to make real community with people I work with and people that I go to church with, there was more of this need to sort of say, like, this is what I'm struggling with, like, please pray for me. What I didn't fathom, and what Williams is saying, is that there's actually an ability to ask another person to carry the weight of the emotion that is sort of like a hurricane going on inside of you, and carry it in such a way that your suffering is lightened, maybe not completely, but lightened. And I was watching a lecture with a teacher who teaches this book to college students, and he said he had 2 college students who, he said he actually, whenever he teaches it, they always come up to him after they read this section, and they ask, like, do you really believe in this? This sounds really weird. This isn't what psychiatrists do. They give medicine and therapy, and your pastor says, I'll pray for you, and that's it. And he always says, no, I think this is real. I think we can ask each other to carry our fears, our burdens, our emotional burdens. And he said he had a student who was afraid of flying, and she had just gotten a job where she would have to fly multiple places, and she was terrified of the idea. And another student who had another fear, and I can't remember exactly what that fear was, but something sort of just typical, incidental, and they were both in the same class reading this book with him, and they planned to carry each other's fears. Between the time he saw them and the next week he saw them again, one of them was going to feel the fear of flying in an airplane, even though he or she had never had that fear. It had never been a big deal. Carry it, know when they were going to get on the flight, be sort of feeling the panic at the moment, and the other person sort of exchange it for this fear that the other person felt. And when he saw them a couple of weeks later, she had taken 3 or 4 flights and had done it in such a way that she said the anxiety was not relieved completely, but in a very strong way relieved. And the other person had sort of approached and conquered this fear, this other fear that they had, by it being sort of shared and exchanged. In my own case, I had a friend recently who she has this characteristic that Williams described, where she sees if there's suffering going on inside of you, even if you're really good at hiding it on the outside, and has this sort of maternal or sort of caring, compassionate personality. And so I told her, you know, these are what my evenings are like. This is the kind of despair I like battle through every night. And I go to the Psalms, I go to prayer, and all these things are good, but it's hard. And we had read this part from Charles Williams, and she kind of committed to start carrying like my evening despair. And would call or text daily, like around 6 or 7 p.m. How are you feeling right now? And I'd just be honest, and she's like, okay, like I'm going to start feeling it, and start praying. And would do that for the course sometimes of like 2 or 3 hours, and steadily over weeks. I mean, every night. And my experience of the evenings and the anxiety and the fear and everything, the weight lifted off tremendously. And I think obviously that is due to prayer, and due to just knowing that someone cares, and it's not gone. It's still there. I don't think the burden's been taken away completely. And if a burden has been taken away, it's by Christ, ultimately. But I never thought that love could happen that way. That you could love another person by carrying a burden in that sense, and so that's what Williams is challenging in this. He thinks that we're created to go around looking for burdens to carry from one another, looking for those times where someone has one that us carrying it could actually be an easier, manageable thing compared to them, and we can lighten their load, and going around accepting and asking for our own burdens to be carried. This one's harder for me. It's a little bit easier for me to offer to be someone else's carrier, but because I don't know, there's just this you have nothing to lose, you're doing a good deed or something, I don't know, but it's really hard to say, I can't carry this by myself, will you help me carry it? It's almost impossible for me, and I don't think I would have ever asked. I think the fact that she offered was what made it possible. So, but it makes me think, what would the love between us as the body of Christ, as fellow human beings, be if that were the kind of way we were interacting. And I think that for Williams, this is part of what it means to have a Christian imagination, to expand your mind that much that you can take in another person's burdens and make them your own, carry them with you, suffer along with, and relieve them of that thing. So, looking at the next quote. Pauline is not too keen on this idea at first. So he says, why do you refuse to lean? I don't, Pauline said bitterly, but she was on the point of saying no help in leaning. She recovered herself and changed it to no need to lean. And if I could, she said, if I could do whatever it is you mean, would I? Would I push my burden onto anybody else? Not if you insist on making a universe for yourself, he answered. If you want to disobey and refuse the laws that are common to us all, if you want to live in pride and division and anger, you can. But if you will be part of the best of us and live and laugh and be ashamed with us, then you must be content to be helped. You must give your burden up to someone else, and you must carry someone else's burden. I haven't made the universe, and it isn't my fault, but I'm sure that this is a law of the universe, and not to give up your parcel is as much to rebel as not to carry another's. You'll find it quite easy if you let yourself do it. And what of my self-respect? She said. He laughed at her with a tender mockery. Oh, if we are of that kind, he exclaimed. If you want to respect yourself, if to respect yourself you must go clean against the nature of things, if you must refuse the omnipotence in order to respect yourself, though why you should want so extremely to respect yourself is more than I can guess. Why? Go on and respect. Must I apologize for suggesting anything else? He mocked her and was silent. For a while she stared back, still irresolute. He held her. Presently, he held her at command. A long silence had gone by before he spoke again. When you are alone, he said, remember that I am afraid instead of you, and that I have taken over every kind of worry. Think merely that. Say to yourself, he is being worried, and go on. Remember, it is mine. If you do not see it, well, if you do, you will not be afraid. And since you are not afraid, she stood up. I can't imagine not being afraid, she said. But you will not be, he answered, also rising, certainty in his voice, because you will leave all that to me. Will you please me by remembering that absolutely? I am to remember, she said, and almost broke into a little trembling laugh, that you are being worried and terrified instead of me? That I have taken it all over, he said. So there is nothing left for you. And I'm going to actually move to this last quote. So they have this. So she agrees. She actually agrees. I think she half believes that this might work, half doesn't. Probably 70% of her thinks this is crazy. What am I doing? But maybe what do I have to lose? And she walks home, and it's this typical walk that she takes where she always sort of dreads encountering her copy, and it's one that she does quite often. And then Williams describes the practice, the mental practice that Stanhope takes on, the way that he puts himself in her situation. So this is how he describes it. Meanwhile, he disposed the rest of his attention according to his promise. He recollected Pauline. He visualized her going along a road, any road. He visualized another Pauline coming to meet her. And as he did so, his mind contemplated not the first, but the second Pauline. He took trouble to apprehend the vision. He summoned through all his sensations an approaching fear. Deliberately, he opened himself to that fear, laying aside for a while every thought of why he was doing it, forgetting every principle and law, absorbing only the strangeness and the terror of that separate spiritual identity. His more active mind reflected it in an imagination of himself going into his house and seeing himself, but he dismissed that, for he desired to subdue himself not to his own natural sensations, but to hers first, and then to let hers, if so it should happen, be drawn back into his own. But it was necessary first intensely to receive all her spirit's conflict. He sat on, imagining to himself the long walk with its sinister possibility, the ogreish world lying around, the air with its treachery to all sane appearance. His own eyes began to seek and strain and shrink. His own feet, quiet though actually they were, began to weaken with the necessity of advance upon the road down which the girl was passing. The body of his flesh received her alien terror. His mind carried the burden of her world. The burden was inevitably lighter for him than for her, for the rage of a personal resentment was lacking. He endured her sensitiveness, but not her sin. The substitution there, if indeed there is a substitution, is hidden in the central mystery of Christendom, which Christendom itself has never understood nor can. Since he could not take, nor would have admitted, her hate and rejection, her passion was received into the lucidity of his own spirit. The experience itself, sharply as his body took it, was less sharp for him. Not that he willed it so, but because his senses receive their communication from within, not from without. And there is in all holy imagination, from goodwill, a quality of greatness, which purifies and stabilizes experience. His goodwill went to its utmost, and utmost goodwill can go very far. It went to all but actual vision, and it excluded his intellectual judgment of that vision. Had he been asked at that moment for his judgment, he would have answered that he believed sincerely, that Pauline believed sincerely that she saw, but whether the sight was actual or not, he could not tell. He would have admitted that it might be but a fantastic obsession of her brain. That made no difference to his action. And this last paragraph is key. If a man seems to himself to endure the horrors of shipwreck, though he walks on dry land and breathes clear air, the business of his friend is more likely to be to accept those horrors as he feels them, carrying the burden, than to explain that the burden cannot, as a matter of fact, exist. Given all reasonable talk as well, wherever there is intelligence enough for exchange and substitution to exist, there is place enough for action. So this is really fascinating to me, and I actually honestly still don't know quite what I think all the way. But I do know that part of what he's saying is that in the practice of carrying her burden, he takes on the hardship without taking on some of the sin that enwraps it. So in her character, there's a bitterness, there's a refusal to be helped, there's all these things, and so as he takes it on, it actually is it's a lighter load for him to carry, but he can carry it, and he carries it as a real thing. I think that even if it wasn't sin that was affecting her, but just this paralyzing fear. There's such a thing that when you aren't the debilitated one, but you take on those feelings, that in a certain sense you can carry them a little bit easier than the person that is, and you're only taking it on for an hour or 2 hours, and then you're sort of giving it back up. So it isn't that you're living through 24/7 every day. And Williams does actually there's a whole other narrative in this book that I think is probably really important that we can't go into, but it's the sort of flip side of loving in a sort of possessive way. So I think that there's a fear there can be a fear when you read this, that there's something almost too obsessive about this, that you're encountering this person's world almost too much, that it could lead to you ruminating constantly over how they're doing and sort of sinking in their own, the way like a mother might sink in her teenage child's sort of bad decisions and just not be able to carry them. But he sort of outlines this other character and the way and he's a man who's sort of slowly taking himself to hell, but he's trying to love this idealized version of this woman that's very far from the real version of her, and all of his attempts at empathy are so far from empathetic. They're actually more of an attempt to manipulate and control, and so I think that the novel itself is instructive in having these two different relationships side by side, having the one between Stanhope and Pauline where he's not expecting her to carry anything necessarily in return. This is just something that he's doing for her. He's not forcing her to become something different than she is. And this other one that sort of maybe begins innocent but turns very quickly into something sort of evil and destructive. So I think that it takes a lot of sort of determined selflessness to set aside for even an evening your own worries and concerns and decide, I'm going to carry someone else's. And maybe this is what we do in petitionary prayer when we pray for people that we care about. I think it is, and I think that what Williams is saying is that there's something required of the imagination of both parties, that or that there's something sort of incredible that can happen when both the person accepts that and believes that their burden can be carried, and the carrier truly carries it. Williams actually set up a little society it was called the Companions of Co-Inherence, and it was interesting. I mean, they sort of talked about this idea. They thought, well, let's put this into practice, and they would just sign up to carry each other's burdens. This is what I'm carrying. Does anyone want to carry this? I will. Sometimes material things, sometimes worry about finances, sometimes fears, depression, but people sort of stating openly a burden that they're carrying that they feel it's too heavy to carry by themselves, and then in certain ways having their own load lightened by agreeing to carry someone else's. Yeah.
Specifically, I'm thinking of the verse in Galatians: bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ.
Wow.
But my father once was at an altar at a healing service in the Episcopal Church, and he was praying for someone who was in the hospital. And while it was the Holy Communion in the Episcopal Church, but it was a healing service directed towards healing. And he was praying for the healing of someone else. And while he was there, he heard a cutting in his ear. And when he got up and left, his hearing had improved. And it never changed. It never went back.
Wow. Wow.
So I really understand what you're saying, and I was reading about the co-inherence in here, just on a blurb, that Christ is involved in that with us when we do that for one another. It's the joining of three.
Right, the Trinitarian. Christ is maybe the middle term. Christ is the bridge and the model, and the one that's come before and done it first.
And I think that's a lot of what therapy was designed to be. That when you unload on this other person, that you're sharing that. There's a certain amount of sharing that's going on.
Right. No, definitely. I think that the thing that never totally worked for me with therapy is that the therapist remains so calm and collected. And so, like, you don't have the terror. Like, there is no terror and, like, hurricane in your soul happening right now, you know?
That's kind of where it came from. And if you think about it, you probably have a friend somewhere that you do this with.
Yeah.
If you don't, get one.
Yes. And it's worth asking yourself, am I someone who offers this to people first, and then am I someone who asks this of people? Are both hard for me? Is one hard? How can I do either one of those things more? And am I scared to lean? Yeah.
I like how you tie this back into imagination, because I think there are a couple of times when I've had a brilliant moment to actually put myself in my husband's shoes for 20 seconds, and it is exhausting. I totally picture myself with his concerns, his stresses. It's like an elastic band, like it can stretch for a second, and then I've got to snap back to myself. And I think it's, as a discipline and imagination, I think it's probably incredibly healthy. And also from a spiritual perspective, really self-sacrificing, because you are literally trying to forget yourself and put yourself in another person's shoes. And it's a lot harder than, at least for me, it's a lot harder than I thought it would be.
Yeah. No, I think I think this is why Williams thinks the spousal relationship is such a great example of Christ's love for the church, and that your job is to do that for a very particular other person, to a certain extent, off and on, and I think parents do this for their children, and teachers do it for their students, definitely. But I think that, yeah, again, I would say, so for me, the revelation in certain ways was that I realized I'm not good at ever asking. It almost makes me cringe to think of asking. But I love giving it. So why would I think that no one, would be willing to carry a little bit of that for me? And so, I think there's a humility in that, and a trust and a exercise of the imagination, that both on the side of believing that someone actually is loving enough and willing to carry something for you, and the side of doing the carrying yourself. So that's what I have for tonight.